My name is Catherine Baker. I'm a new director of the UC Student and Policy Center, and I'm not doing all the work here today. We've got the Great Possibility Lab to do that and our speakers, but I am warmly welcoming you to the center. This is the University of California's new presence in Sacramento, both for engaging with policy leaders and policy makers, not just in Sacramento, but also across the state. And we look forward to welcoming you here for programs exactly like this, where you get to talk about not only how we're able to contribute as a university to policy solutions and make great conversations, but innovation and ways in which the university can be in service to government so that all of our lives are better. How is that? With that, you have a great program today with the Possibility Lab. We're delighted to have you here. I hope you will be in this building many times. And if you're ever looking for a place to have great conversations and convenings, please think of the UC Center Sacramento. Thank you, Amy, for taking it from here.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. So I'm so pleased to see you all for what I know will be a really interesting conversation today around this really broad question of how can state government partner with the university system around all of the things that we partner. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Possibility Lab. First, let me say there is lunch, I promise. We did not bring you here under false pretenses. Our delivery person had a medical emergency on the way over, and so is heading back so that they can swap out another driver. She is okay. But it means we'll be a little delayed. Lunches are boxes though, so at the very worst, you can take it with you. But we'll try and wrap up right on time so that we can have a little bit of time for people to chat and have lunch, but I hope nobody's starving. I will flag when it comes, and if you are starving or gonna have a medical emergency, if you don't eat, you are welcome to sneak out and grab a box and bring it back in. So with that, I'm Amy Lerman. I'm the Executive Director of the Possibility Lab, and I'm going to tell you just briefly sort of what we do to set the stage for our three fantastic partners who are going to talk a little bit about their experience partnering on a variety of questions and projects with the lab. I'll go like this, and I'll pretend I'm clicking, and then you just move the slide. So the Possibility Lab is a research lab that is a little bit different from your typical university lab. All of the work that we do is actually in partnership with state and local government and community organizations to think about policy problems that are of interest to researchers, but more fundamentally are of interest to our state partners. And we really try and think together about how data and evidence and civic engagement can be used to make good decisions, to communicate the work of the state, and really to bring residents into the process of problem solving and governance. And so we do a lot of work across the board with our partners. We definitely aren't the parachute in, take your data and maybe report it back to you. We really try to be a close collaborator and partner. And so they're sick of me because we have spent the last couple of years talking all the time and really working our way through, trying to understand each other. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is how you build trust with external researchers, how you navigate the challenges of having really different sort of timelines and priorities, how you think about funding and sort of co-funding and co-fundraising, and a variety of other issues that come up in the kinds of partnerships we're trying to forge. And we're really excited about this sort of new model of how we can do this work together. So really, fundamentally, our lab sits at this intersection of community and California residents, of government, both state and local, and then researchers. And our lab is actually about half practitioners and half researchers. So folks like Jesse and Emily Swide, who is wrangling lunch, right, who come out of state government. And so even internally, we're really sort of doing a lot of the work of translation and thinking together about how to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. Our core principles really are empowerment, equity, and engagement. And all of the work that we do focuses in some really broad way on these questions. Around engagement, we're always thinking about how we can help our government partners think about community engagement in deeper and richer ways. We're really looking for partners who are interested and excited even if they're a little daunted at the process of doing good community engagement, trying to help partners think beyond the sort of town hall where the same group of people show up and yell at you, right? But really think about how you can use those opportunities not just to hear criticism, although we can't promise that that won't be part of the experience, but really to gather the kind of intelligence that can help inform your decisions, right? How do you really channel the work of community engagement into productive intelligence from communities? Around empowerment, we think both about empowering residents to make kind of informed decisions and help to provide useful and relevant input, but also how we empower our partners, right? To think about their own data, to collect data, to use data in ways that are productive, and also to help communicate that data. So we have a multimedia team. We think a lot about how you meet people where they are and how you make data really accessible. And then equity, that's the obvious one, right? Really trying to think about how we help you do the work of serving all of California. Our projects are really broad. This is just a couple of examples of our current partners. We're working across a number of different policy spaces. We really think of those core principles as being our guiding principles, and then we think about them across a variety of policy spaces, from housing to incarceration, to really thinking about the sort of nuts and bolts of data. And our partners today will talk a little bit about the different kinds of projects that we've been working on with them. And finally, we have a couple of broad initiatives where we're really thinking about how to learn not just from our individual partnerships, but across our partnerships. And so one of the things that we're really excited about is also helping our partners connect with each other to really think about how the sort of accumulation of what we learn, whether it's around civic engagement or the use of data, how it really can build towards an evidence-based practice that we can then share out more widely. And so thinking about trying to connect the dots across state government and our growing sort of list of partners. So I'm really excited, and that's all the talking I am required to do today. So now the onus is on you all. So I am thrilled to introduce three of our fantastic partners. Marianne Bates, Executive Director at Cradle to Career, Becky Monroe, until very recently Deputy Director at the Civil Rights, and Sebastian Sanchez, Deputy Secretary at Labor and Workforce Development. And I'm gonna ask each of them just to talk a little bit about their experience working with external researchers, the work that we've been doing with them, and then also sort of the opportunities and challenges of that work. And so I'll start with you, Marianne.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be with all of you here today. Thank you. I'm Marianne, Executive Director of the Cradle to Career Data System. We're a brand new entity within the state, started about 2.5 years ago, and we're within the Government Operations Agency. So the Cradle to Career Data System exists to bring together data that the state has long collected, but that's too often remained in silos. So we're bringing together data from K-12 education, from higher education, workforce data, so we can see how people are doing. Are they getting jobs? How much are they earning? We're bringing together health and human services data. So we're bringing all this together and stitching it together, and the whole point is to help Californians use that data. So I can just end with one sentence and we'd be like done for the day. Partners like the Possibility Lab are a huge component of how we can ensure that data actually gets used for decision making, gets used by families, by teachers, by practitioners, and can really inform decisions that people make about deciding what job training or what college path to take, decisions guidance counselors make, and supporting the young people they're working with, decisions that get made here in Sacramento by policymakers. And our whole purpose is to help Californians build more equitable futures. So that's a long-winded way of saying we're bringing the data together to ensure people can actually use it. But there's a lot of work that happens between the technical work that my team does to literally, find data points and bring them together and stitch them together, to ensuring we're putting out stuff that people will actually use. How can we make sure that our first data dashboards, which we're calling data stories, actually resonate with real humans? Because just because I love it or my team loves it doesn't mean that people will actually use it. So that's where the work with the Possibility Lab is really crucial. And I put it into two buckets. So one, they're really excellent technical work on the research itself, has already been helpful. And as we make the data more available to researchers, I imagine will be a huge part of studies that are spurred by our data and can be used. But the engagement with communities is also really important. So the way we're working with the Possibility Lab is they're helping us find people where they are in the lead up to the first data story that we're releasing, so that we can hear from people and not just take a kind of passive approach to saying our meetings are all public, right? We're subject to Bagley-Keene, California's open meeting laws, right? People can come and give public comment at the many meetings we host all the time, but we also know that that's not enough. And so we're reaching out and going to schools, going to meet practitioners where they are, and the Possibility Lab is helping us do that thoughtfully. So, why are we working with them? One story I'll just tell. At Cradle to Career, it's incredibly important to us that our values are driving the work that we do. That when people interact with Cradle to Career, they can see that we're trying to engage with them in a respectful way, with transparency, with curiosity. And I went to one of the events that you hosted in Oakland, where the Possibility Lab had done this really cool project on working with the community to see how they would measure safety in their own community. And what came through to me in seeing their partners speak about how they've been engaged in the work was just how respectful and how real it was. And that's a huge compliment to what we're required to do by law and having official Bagley-Keene events where people can give us that public comment. Yes, that's important, and it's not sufficient. So we're really grateful to have this partnership and to have the Possibility Lab help strengthen our community engagement work. And there's so much more I could say, but I'll pause and let you continue.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Becky Monroe, and until 2 weeks ago when I moved to Michigan, I was the Deputy Director of the California Civil Rights Department, focused primarily on California versus hate, as well as the Community Conflict Resolution Unit. We came to Possibility Lab early, and that's something I'm just going to emphasize, that working with partners early is really helpful, and I will tell you why in just a moment. But part of this was we launched California versus Hate. We have about a year under our belt. This is the state's first statewide resource line and network for people targeted for hate. What does this mean? It means people can reach out to us by phone or online and report any act of hate or discrimination. So as you can tell just by the setup, we are going to be having access to some of the most painful, often personal and important data that people might share about what their experience with hate. We had 3 main goals with California versus Hate. One was we wanted to let people know what their options were when they were targeted for hate. We wanted people to understand that if you are targeted for hate, there may be legal options. There may be a crime. There may not be a crime, but it may be a civil rights violation. Or it may not be against the law, but it still caused harm. We want people to know you have options across the board if you have been subjected to any of these forms of hate. Secondly, we wanted to connect people with culturally competent resources and support. Again, I'm just going to say data comes through all of this. The first part, what are your options? We need to be able to understand where people are being targeted for hate, what is their experience, so that we can then inform that second piece. What does culturally competent resources and support mean? It means language accessibility, but it also means connecting with more resources across our state, with community leaders across our state who have, in many cases, for generations, been combating racism and discrimination and other forms of hate, but they haven't been connected to the people who need their services. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is to connect people. But if we don't know where their needs are, if we aren't able to accurately document that, it's a lot harder for us to make those connections. And then finally, we very explicitly wanted to improve data collection around hate. We wanted to do it, again, not just because we think data is good and helpful, but because we have an obligation, if people are reporting acts of hate to us, to use that to actually connect them with real resources and support. And we know data is underreported. I will talk a little bit later about the ways we know that that is underreported. We are incredibly fortunate in California. We have so many more resources here. We have a law that requires, for example, law enforcement to report hate crimes. That's not the case in other states. All of that said, it is dramatically underreported. And if you are in a community where you know you have been targeted for an act of hate, And the data that you're hearing reported, or you're hearing the police say, or you're hearing media say, there's no hate crimes, or we've reported 5 hate crimes, that sends a really clear message to who our state is serving. So part of what we wanted to do was to improve that, and that's why we have this new system. And so we engaged with Possibility Lab pretty early on because we wanted to do 2 main things. One is, when we're capturing the data, are we doing it in a way that makes it easy for people to report, that kind of makes the burden as low on them as possible, and that allows us to capture accurate data. We have a very close relationship with Possibility Lab. They may have seen me near tears at one point, because when we were first talking about collecting data, we wanted to give people as many options as possible. There was a chance that the way we had originally envisioned this meant that some of the data we had gathered we wouldn't be able to use. It had to do with sort of, were there too many options? Fortunately, they problem solved with us, made a way to make sure we could keep that data and we could capture that data and use that data. But I will say, so that if you're capturing data, make sure you've got experts on board so you're doing it the right way. Because my goodness, if someone has trusted us enough to call and we don't use that data in the way we committed to, we have a big problem. Then the second piece is, how do you use data? How do we make sure that the data we're collecting can be used not only by the government, by policymakers, but also by community organizations and civil rights groups who actually are the reason that we have California versus hate. They are the reason we created this hotline. They need that data to be able to advocate effectively. We also need that data to make sure we're actually serving all Californians. So we've been really lucky to work with Possibility Lab, both on the upfront piece and then on the second piece, which is the data usable? Because if you just give numbers without context, it could actually cause more harm. And that's really true in the context of hate, because we know that part of the reasons the data is not reliable is that communities who have targeted for hate often don't trust the very same government and entities that they might report to. So sometimes you might see numbers that don't show as many people targeted in a particular community as you might expect, and that's because we haven't done a good enough job yet of reaching those communities. So we don't want to put data out there that people then take and run with without that context, and that's something that Possibility Lab understands. And I will just end with this, that they've been incredibly helpful, and part of why we were so excited to work with them is our work. When we talk about being community-centered, we really want to act on it, which means if the community tells us, if we have structures where we have regular input, we get critique all the time. If they tell us we're doing something wrong, we have to act on it. And the Possibility Lab recognizes that we have this sort of very, almost like a sacred relationship with these groups. They are our lifeblood, so if we aren't able to effectively engage, and it's a two-way thing, it's not us just saying, here's your rights, here's what you have to do. It is, how do we listen? How do we act on that data? And they've been really helpful in helping us structure that as well.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, everyone. Sebastian Sanchez, Deputy Secretary for Immigrant and Agriculture Workforce at Labor Agency. I came to work with the Possibility Lab as we finally got around to evaluating our COVID-19 workplace outreach project. So definitely a lesson learned about working early, and I'll talk a bit about a new project as well that we're going to engage the team earlier this time around. When we first started the COVID-19 CWAP, it's called, that's the acronym, we started working on it August of 2020. It was a crazy moment. Everyone was just rushing. We were giving funding for 6 months. So I remember at that time, well, there's no point in doing a pre and post evaluation because it's too short of a time period. You're not going to really be able to see whether the needle moves. Fine. We did another 6 months. Then we did another 6 months, and now we're on our 5th iteration, and we still haven't done an evaluation of whether or not we can demonstrate that this works. And the community partners that we're funding over 60 organizations throughout the state to deliver outreach material to workers and to engage with those workers, educate those workers. They were pushing to make this a permanent program. So when we're talking to the legislators, they're asking us, how do you know that this works? And I tell them, I just believe in it. Like that it is a program that, from my personal experience, I know that it is a good way to get a trusted messenger to engage with community members. But we kept getting that question of, well, how do you measure whether or not worker behavior has changed in how they engage with the state and how they report claims, and whether or not they better understand the law. And these are questions that we just had not built into our data collection. We had a pretty robust method and ask of organizations to give us data, but then we didn't do much with it, right? I think that this was a problem that Becky mentioned. So as we're going through all these various iterations, finally we were like, okay, let's figure this out. And we talked to other groups that really were pushing solely a qualitative analysis of CWAP, which I think is critical. But we really wanted to get that quantitative aspect. And I think engaging the Possibility Lab that had those experts that had that capacity to help us work through doing a blind testing of sending out surveys, a random survey test, is something that was really important for us to be able to show that, look, this is something that's not just an entity getting feedback from a CBO that is self-interested because they want to continue getting this funding. So we really needed to test our theory of change. We had a theory of change. We believe fully that engaging with organizations to get the message out is something that works, but we need to show it. So we were able to work with the Possibility Lab, and actually a major thank you to the Possibility Lab that after our funding fell through, they went out and got their own funding to do a test of CWAP. So right now, we just finished up the qualitative aspect. We're going through the surveys at the moment. But it was just such a huge win for us that the Possibility Lab believed in this program, wanted to demonstrate that this program works, that they went out and got their own funding to do it. The other thing is, as we tested out strategies, outreach strategies, we kept evolving, right? We got feedback, and I should say the program partners that we work with give us a lot of feedback on, these are the outreach strategies that are working, that are not working. We went out and did labor rights caravans where we brought all the state agencies together and drove around the fields, trying to access farm workers where they're at, where they work, where they congregate after and before work. And from that, we got feedback, okay, that's great, that's a great presence, but you need to build a permanent presence. It can't just be a one-time or quarterly thing. So we started building out this program to create one-stop shops where we're going to just launch permanent clinics in rural areas of the state to really reduce the obstacles that farm workers have in engaging state services. And this is where we now are with the Possibility Lab, talking through a scope of work of how do we ensure that the data we collect in that space is useful? What is the data that we should be collecting? How do we set it up so that it can be properly evaluated? And that has just been a very different conversation than the one we were going through in CWAP, where it's just like, this is the model we have. Can you figure it out? Can you work through it and identify how we can test this? So it's just been a great learning experience for me as well. I don't have a background in evaluation at all. I was an attorney, a practicing attorney for 10 years, and data science is not something I had a lot of engagement with. So Amy might say that she thinks we're sick of them, but it's really been wonderful to have a team that is engaging with us regularly, that treats our partners as well in that same way, that's really educating them as to the value of evaluation. So it's been a great opportunity for our teams to learn and develop the skill set, and just really looking forward to continuing the work together.
Thank you all. That's great. So I'm curious, I feel like some of the things that came up really are lessons learned, right? Sort of partnering early. I'm curious if you have to think about, like, what are the one or two things you would want other state departments and agencies to know about how to approach these kinds of collaborations? What makes for a successful collaboration, and what are the considerations in how to structure it or how to proceed?
I'm happy to start on that one. I think the one very early thing that's really important for us to do on the state side is to be clear about our learning agenda. Why are we bringing this data together? What answers do we not know, what questions do we not know the answers to, where people would take different decisions or do something differently if we just knew the answer to that question? And I think that prioritization exercise is really important for government to do and be really transparent about. So for example, with the Cradle to Career data system, there was a public planning process for 2 years before our office was established. And the legislation that started that had 6 key areas with specific questions written into it. So why are we building this data system? Well, We don't understand the impact of different training and higher education pathways in the labor market. We want to know more about the impact of early childhood education. We want to know more about nonlinear paths, right? There were 6 major topics that were written into the legislation. And I think starting with that purpose, like the why, right? Why are we working so hard to bring this data together to engage with communities? Well, because they're important questions we don't know the answer to. And so being clear from the state side about what those priority questions are can help researchers and partners on the outside know how to respond. The second piece, you already mentioned early, and just thinking about like the practical ways in which we sign MOUs or plan to spend money, right? Many of you, if you're here in Sacramento, know this, right? But a budget is barely signed when you have to start thinking about the next one, which means that you somehow have to predict that like 15 months from now, I would like to work with a really amazing group and plan for that and ask for resources and set aside time. That's hard to do. So one thing that's really powerful that I know the state is working on and folks at GovOps are working on is to have umbrella agreements that can provide like an overarching way to have partnerships, and then you can have lots of little mini partnerships under that. And that could mean like different state entities can work with the Possibility Lab. It could mean like different state entities can work with the University of California. Even within our partnership, we've had some flexibility where we signed this like overarching thing, and then I think it's the task orders, right? Where you say like, oh, that thing we talked about a few months ago, there's now a different priority. Can you work with us on this thing? And so we don't have to start all over with our lawyers talking with each other. We can just work on that little task order and pivot and work on what's a priority today. So thinking about like a big umbrella thing that gets signed, and then flexibility over time to be able to pivot and work on the priorities is really helpful. And then maybe just one more thing, I think it's also really important to talk from the outset, again, going back to values about how is this information going to be used? Do we have expectations about results being made public, or research studies being available, or analysis plans, like just those kinds of expectations of what are we going to do with this information that you're bringing to us can be really helpful to talk about at the planning stage so that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're producing and why.
And I would agree with all of those points. Another thing I would say is, and I know this is going to sound sort of odd, but don't be afraid of the data. So you may hear information that is not wholly flattering to the work that you have done in the past, and that's okay. And the way that we've prepared for that is we set really clear parameters going back to what is our goal with this data, what do we want to use, what kind of information are we asking for, and also acknowledging at the outset, we may not have the answers for all of the issues that are revealed through this data. We say that every time we talk to partners and say, what do you wish you had? We have to be honest. I don't have endless resources to make sure that we have culturally appropriate mental health services in that part of the state right now. But I absolutely can do more when I know we have the need if you document it. So being really prepared and being comfortable with sort of having some critiques that may come out of that data, and that at the end of the day, my experience both here and I was in the federal government before, is if you demonstrate that you trust the community enough to get the data and then to share the data back out with them, you earn so much more credibility than whatever the other side is in terms of losing face. And I'll give you a really one quick example. I mentioned data and hate crimes is sort of notorious in our space for not being very accurate. The way we know that, the federal government has been collecting hate crimes data. Since they've started collecting hate crimes data, we have known a couple of things. One is it's usually between, like, you could see 8, 9, 10,000 hate crimes are reported across the country if you look at the FBI uniform crime reporting data. The same Department of Justice, where I used to work, a different US Department of Justice, a different section, does a sampling methodology, a statistically significant sampling methodology to understand what hate crimes look like by talking to victims. They estimate that it's actually closer to 250,000. So the difference between 250,000 and 8 to 10,000 is pretty stark. Not a great look necessarily for the government, right? To say, well, this is what but what we did with that was we said, okay, we got work to do. Let's get out and at the federal government level, let's talk to every US attorney out there, and they have the ability to convene to get people to report. Let's think about why aren't people reporting? That can set off a whole new research agenda. How do we meet those needs? How do we sort of respect the fact that meet people where they are? And that's part of what we do now with the Possibility Lab. If you've been targeted for hate and you don't want to go to the police, we still want to hear from you, and we can still connect you with resources. If you do want to go to law enforcement, you're not sure what that looks like, let's help you do that. But all of that was because we weren't afraid to look at the data. And I can't tell you the number of times, including when I was in the federal government, where you'll hear some bad stuff. People will yell at you, and I always felt like that was part of my job. You know, that's part of my job in terms of serving people. But if we keep coming back, if you don't sort of run away when people critique you, but you keep coming back and you've got the data that you're hearing from them and you're acting on it, it's really important. The second piece I would say is, it's really important when you collect the data to act on it, which you said. Another thing I want to share around data, since we've started collecting data at the federal level and at the state level, the #1 community targeted for hate in California and across the country, is the #1 active hate is anti-Black hate crimes. It's every year, the #1. The most people who are targeted for hate are Black people in the United States. When you look at policies, it has not always seemed that the policies have been shaped to meet that data. So that was part of what we felt an obligation to do. So if you look at, we took, part of the way we were able to fund some of our work is we had state funding. We have, I think, the best funding in any state in the country for combating hate, a comprehensive approach. We also went out and got federal funding. And that federal funding focused on 2 things. How do we make sure we're actually listening to communities and responding to what they need? So we created an entire position to do that. And the second was, how do we combat anti-Blackness in our state? And we work with California Black media to do that. So again, it's, if you get the data, use it. Because if you get the data, we can't keep telling people, report, we'll act on it, I promise. We've had this data for a long time, we had to show some action. So that's the other piece I would say is really important. And just as a newbie to California contracting, when I first came to the state, being able to work with the UC is a lot easier. You've got the common agreement, it makes it a lot easier. So I would just say from like, you all are incredibly busy, it helps a lot. So I would emphasize that as a plus as well.
Truly echo the interagency agreement as a godsend to contracting. I think the only thing I'll add to what has already been shared is when you think about staffing and who you can have assigned to these programs, don't be scared if you don't have a chief data officer. Don't be scared if you don't have someone who's trained in evaluation. That's something that we've been working through with our departments, where their hesitance and really embracing doing evaluation is like, well, who's going to do this? And I don't know about your departments and agencies, but ours are always strapped. They're under-resourced, right? They don't have enough staff. They're already overwhelmed with the work that they have. So to add on an extra layer of evaluation, learning something new, was seen as a real obstacle for them. But as I noted earlier, if you can work with an entity like the Possibility Lab that can, I wouldn't say it's necessarily hand-holding, but they can educate you through the process and build up your own internal capacity to handle evaluation and looking at what data does, it's a really great thing. And that you can also take advantage of, ODI that has a data acceleration lab. So there are different tools within the state that can really help you with your own staff at their current capacity, skill level, develop the expertise necessary to work on evaluation.
Thank you. I want to build on this question around sort of challenges and fears and hurdles. As you think about the challenges that you've faced, either in establishing these kinds of partnerships or getting enough of the political will or overcoming people's concerns about sort of data or data sharing, what are the primary challenges you've encountered, and how are you thinking about overcoming them that might be useful to others?
I was just going to say, I don't need to start all of them if you'd like to.
Sure, I'll do it. So, I highlighted some of the fear that we had heard, but then I think we overcame that by really, we had such a positive response from our community partners, from civil rights groups across the state. When we said we're going to be as transparent as possible, we will share with you the information we have, we got so much more credibility from that than whatever kind of dangers there were in terms of losing that. I think the other thing I would say is that just in this space generally, I mentioned the hate crimes data space is notoriously underreported. There's two main reasons, we think. One is people fear reporting. So to the extent that again, the communities who are targeted for the hate are the same people who have often had bad experiences with government or with law enforcement. And so how do we earn that trust? And the second piece is sometimes law enforcement may see an act of hate and not recognize it as a hate crime. So there's an education piece there too. But with respect to that first piece, part of the challenge was we could be the best government agency ever. We think we are, we're doing the best we can. We're still the government. So part of what we were able to do, and again, this is why Possibility Lab was such a great partner for us, was to work with community-based organizations that have earned that trust. So go to the LGBTQ center, go to the mosque, go to the synagogue, go to a smaller sort of like Chinatown Services Center, work with organizations that have earned that trust and serve them. So that's another piece that I would say was a challenge initially in sort of how do we collect data when people are scared to come to us? Let's go to the place where they are, where they're not scared and serve their needs. And that's a little bit of a different sort of, I mean, it's all the same end user at the end of the day, but it's really making sure that we're tailoring our work to the needs of community-based organizations that have earned that trust. So that's another piece that we found really effective. It sounds similar to what you were doing. And then we carry that through, so we use the data here, we carry that through with our marketing and outreach. So a lot of our materials for advertising California versus hate are made so that smaller CBOs can take them and run with them, change them, do whatever they need to do with them. But that's another piece I would say, a challenge, we're still the government, an option is then go to the places that have earned that trust and find a way to serve their needs.
Yeah, I think another fear that comes up is, and you might have mentioned this, Becky, but what does that data say about your work? And I think within government, we're sensitive, right? We put a lot of time and effort into the models that we develop, and we own them, and we're very proud of them. And there's a concern once you start doing some of the interviews with the partners that, what are they going to say about this work? And how do we control that messaging? And what is it going to say if we get feedback that this tactic that we're using, that we've invested a significant amount of resources, isn't working how we thought that it would work? But I'd much rather have that information than just be blindly walking through and just kind of being like, this is a good idea. This seems like this would work. So I think that that's something that you have to work through. I think that you have to connect with your comms team and let them know, like, this is happening, this is something we're looking at. You have to, of course, keep your leadership fully informed and briefed on things, but connecting with the governor's office as well and letting them know, like, this is the reason that we're doing this study. Ultimately, it all reflects back on them, so we're, of course, going to get guidance. But I think there's a real concern and fear about whether everything that's going to be said is positive about the work that you're doing, and you have to be prepared to accept some of that negative commentary or showing that a program that you're designing is not working so that you can improve.
I want to pull on the thread a little bit around what you were saying, the danger or the fear that exists around what story is the data going to tell. So one thing that's unique about the Cradle to Career data system is that we're stitching the data together, but it's not actually our data. It's the people of California's data, but even more to the point, it's stewarded and owned, if you will, by a lot of different entities. Labor and Workforce Development Agency is one, but our common legal agreement that we signed has 18 signatures at the bottom of it, of different state entities who've agreed to share their data with us. But as we all know, right, data can tell a very powerful story. And part of the way that the agreement to build our data system came about is that our office was tasked with being a neutral source of trusted information. So my answer to, like, what's the challenge and how do we address this is through governance and planning for transparency from the start. So I report to a 21-person governing board. Half of that governing board is comprised of our data partners. So Labor and Workforce Development Agency has a seat. K-12 Education has a seat. Each of the higher education entities has a seat. The other half are appointees who represent the people of California who want to use this data, right? Appointees of the governor's office, the legislature. So I report to them. We have this very large and complicated governance structure in place, but what that means is that the context for that legal agreement that got signed is that there is a public decision-making process around what data is coming in and how is it going to be used. And that really helps because then there aren't surprises. People can say, oh, why are you building this dashboard? Well, here's years of public meetings and notes that show how we came to these conclusions with a lot of input from a lot of different parties. Another part of that governance structure, because we're this intended to be a neutral source of trusted information, we're not planning to analyze the data and then put out policy recommendations as an office, but we will host a research library. So when researchers at the Possibility Lab or other universities or research centers or community organizations do studies using Cradle to Careers data, we'll then put those studies in the research library so that people can take a look at them and then decide, okay, here's what this study did, here's what that study did, and draw their own conclusions. So that governance structure helps because of decision making. And then planning for transparency helps too. So in our governance documents, it's described that when researchers and community members come to us and ask for access to the data, at least once a year, one of our advisory boards is in a public meeting going to review all the requests that came in and have transparency around which ones were approved and which ones were denied. So that there's transparency around who's using this data for what purposes and try to be as transparent as possible about that. I'll give one more example that's actually not from California, but the Office of Evaluation Sciences was started by the Obama administration, has continued for more than 10 years now across 3 very different administrations. And they're a unit within the federal government, housed at the General Services Administration, so somewhat similar to GovOps, I suppose. And they work with other federal agencies to conduct experiments and studies and help entities use their own data. And they have an evaluation policy, which is essentially their values that they post online, that I brought along. And under transparency, they say, we keep a public record of all evaluations fielded and publicize all of our findings, including null results, and those that run counter to our own prior expectations and goals. And because they made that very clear from day one, before they even started their first study, that was the expectation. So I've looked to that as a real model. I think being clear from the start about setting expectations around transparency can help set the stage for these amazing examples you were citing of saying we can learn from results, even if they're surprising. Because that's what we're here to do. So the governance structures, being clear about who's deciding about this stuff, right? Who's making these decisions? And then planning for transparency, I think, can really help address some of the biggest challenges.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from you all. And that's, so when we think about data, and we've talked a lot about sort of how we use it and how we collect it, but I'm curious sort of as you think about different kinds of data. So we often think about big administrative data sets, but there's also qualitative data, focus groups, surveys, and then narrative, sort of the role that being able to tell stories across the data and sort of how that helps you communicate. So I know that these are conversations we've had across all of these projects, and I would just be curious sort of if you'd talk a little bit about how you think about different kinds of data and the ways that they can come together to help you communicate what you do.
Yeah, I think the qualitative data is really critical, and particularly when we're working with community partners that are really localized, are really community members that have started developing their own outreach programs. The way that they can communicate what their thoughts are through these kind of focus groups, one-on-one interviews, and that's knowledge that you can't glean from any type of number. So it's just been really important for us to get that clarity on what our programming looks like and how it functions, how it's impacting their ability to provide services. Without doing those focus groups and one-on-one interviews, it's just not feasible to get that story. So as much as we want to have that hard data that we can go to the legislature with and say, look, 1 + 1 = 2, we need to be able to tell that story and be able to tell that narrative and to communicate it not only to decision makers in the legislature and the governor's office, but also to the community and show them why our programs are working. And you can do that much better when you're using the voices of the people that are doing the work and that are being engaged with the work.
Yeah, this is sort of central to our work, is recognizing that when we're talking about being community-centered, that means, again, hearing directly from community, hearing what we're doing wrong, and then using that right away. So I'll give you a really small example. We were talking to a large civil rights organization that has sort of different branches across the state, and we have our thing, this is what we've done, we've heard from people, we have these sort of outreach materials that are great, and this is, and they were really skeptical, understandably, and they said, my community's been targeted for hate for generations, the government hasn't shown up, how do I know you'll take my advice? And we're like, well, give us some. And one was, you need to have materials that look like this. You need to tell, a story from the beginning to end. I need more details here. And we said, okay. And then within a few weeks, we turned it around, gave it back to them and said, is this what you were thinking about? They said, yes. And then we produced it and got it out into the world. So that's a small example, but it does show sort of a respect for when you hear from different voices. I think the other piece, and we've been really grateful, because again, Possibility Lab does this with us as well, is the data matters with legislators, with everyone. Stories matter with everyone too. And when we are able to really, again, with all the protections in place, making sure someone's comfortable sharing their story, if they're not, sharing a story in a way that they are comfortable with. But when we hear more voices and people are able to talk, in our case, about the impact of hate and discrimination, the impact of actually connecting with resources that met their needs, we are so much more effective in doing outreach because people can connect and say that, I hear them, I see me in that story, and I actually am more willing to engage. So it's such a powerful combination to have the numbers and the stories and show them together that it's been, for us, that's the only way I think we can do this work. And I think, back in my past life working at the federal government, it was the same. Like when people would come in and tell their stories, at the end of the day, we're human. The people we report to are human. The legislators are human. So having those stories behind are really important, and having an entity that understands that facilitating that is really critical has been incredibly helpful.
I love this question so much because my career before I came to government work was actually in research, quantitative research. And so often this is set up as an either or. Like either you have very rigorous quantitative data or you just have stories, right? It was like, you have to listen to our stories, it's not represented in the data. And it's a yes and. And one of the things I love about the work we're doing with Possibility Lab is that this first data story we're putting out, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are in those data visualizations, right? We have this really cool Sankey diagram we're showing of flows from high school and higher education and different paths. But then we're working to pop out from that where you see an actual person's face who's agreed to have their story told and said, this was Mary Ann's journey. Right? If you click on this path of community college to a 4-year degree, for example, like that person's face pops out and you hear that specific story, because that's how we as humans interact with the world. So yes, quantitative research are forever, right? But when I think about why I show up every day, why I took this job, why I think it's such a rare opportunity, it's because I'm thinking about my parents, right? Who both got their GEDs and then had a very non-linear path through higher education, right? I'm thinking about my uncle who, got stuck in remedial education classes and never continued at community college, even though he's a brilliant engineer, right? Those are the stories in my head that motivate me every day when I'm looking at, 100,000 data points. And our brains work through stories, right? You look at 100,000 people's data, you can tell it's important, but when a face pops out and humanizes it, it makes you care, right? It puts the why into it. So it's both and I love how all of the work that all three of us are describing is really leveraging both of those things. It's the power of real quantitative data and the power of stories, and when brought together, it's, I think that's where the real magic can happen.
Thank you. So I want to open it up, and I see some partners in the audience, so also feel free to ask questions. Feel free also to share your experience with some of these questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this brilliant discussion. I'm learning so much from just listening to this panel. Yesenia Jimenez, she, her, ella pronouns from End Child Poverty in California. And oftentimes a lot of my work is really with working with legislators and putting together ideas that are coming from our community on how we can solve this issue of poverty, right? But then on the other side, not just stopping at the legislation and getting it signed, but actually helping departments implement, which is really, really crucial. And so I loved what you said, and I'm happy to talk more about some of that after this panel, of course. But I loved what you said when, Mary, I think you said that this is not our data, this is the people's data. And I find that so brilliant because ultimately, I think sometimes when the community really struggles in terms of like providing that evidence that it does work, the outreach and work that we do does absolutely work, and we have to partner with our departments in order to prove that with the data. I guess my struggle point is like, how do we ensure that they actually get funded for their work? Because you said this is the people's data, because this is the people's work. How do we ensure that we're connecting that so that the funding actually flows down to our communities to do the work that is providing the data?
I'll just say, I think you hit the crux of a lot of this work. And so what we have done at California versus Hate is we had the same thing. We were saying, okay, we're going to be community-centered, and we're going to ask community organizations, we have to pay them for their time. Because if we're going to do that, it can't be that, because I think to your point too, it's the people's data, and it looks a little exploitative if you're like, give us your data, and then they don't see right away how we're using it, and that we're respecting the resources that they invest in that. So we actually developed, and not to get too California contract centric, but under $10,000, we talked about sort of like what contracts can we develop with smaller community-based organizations to pay them. We had very specific goals for what we were paying them for to make sure that they were providing us technical assistance and feedback, so that when we talk about partnering, to your point, we're genuinely partnering and we're paying them for their time. So I know that sounds like kind of a small technical way of doing it, but you're absolutely right. It is the people's data, and like I said, if we're asking people for information that's incredibly personal and painful, we have an obligation to make sure we're using that data in a way that actually comes back to support the community. So that's why we did that. That's one little way to do it. The other is the transparency piece helps. This is what we did with the data. This is how we use this information. So then they can hold us accountable and say, you said you were going to do this, you didn't do it. In my past work at the U.S. Department of Justice, we did a lot of work, this is going back some time, in the aftermath of the murder of Trayvon Martin, for example. And we were hearing from communities about what they needed and what they needed to see. And we worked with the city there, and they were very transparent. They said, these are our top priorities. If they couldn't meet those priorities, here's why, and here's what we did instead. All of that transparency is really helpful, but paying matters. So I really take your point seriously. We hope that this is a model that others will use as well. If you look at the California Department of Social Services, they have a smaller grant program and a larger grant program that's really funding the community-based organizations that are doing the work. That's a model we need to replicate. It's awesome that California is doing it. We need to do it more. So I would say it's a CDSS Stop the Hate program. They're doing some of that. And then, again, we were trying to replicate that through California versus Hate.
How do you ensure that organizations are being funded? I think one, you need to make sure that whatever partner you're working with on evaluation understands that that's a critical aspect and builds that into their scope of work. You need to have a budget line item for engaging with community partners on doing this work, and it's not just leaning on us to get groups to do more work outside of what their current contract is. So that's an obligation we have when we're contracting with partners. And then I think the other thing that really comes up for me is it's hard when we have such a tight budget situation right now, and there's special funds that you can always tap into, and really looking at working with government partners to identify those special funds that aren't connected to the general fund, and then how can you use those to do this work. And I think that's something that I looked at when we were going through the farm worker, the rural strategic engagement program that we're going to be working on, is how do we make sure that this money can also deliver directly to community partner organizations. So
one thing I'll add that's a bit different, so these ideas around paying contracts, I just want to reinforce, incredibly important. I think the governance structure also shapes this. So most states that created a longitudinal data system, like Cradle to Career, in some cases many years ago, the primary client of that data system is other state entities. So the data analyst over at this department needs the linked data, so I link it, I give it back to them. Or a legislator says, I need these numbers for my district, please provide it to me. Cradle to Career has flipped that, and we're first starting with these dashboards that anyone can use on our website. It would be a lot easier to start by just sending a flat file over to another data analyst inside the state. It's a lot more work to create a public-facing dashboard. But the reason why we prioritize that first is because the decision-making around the creation of this data system had people at the table with a vote from the beginning, who, in addition to our wonderful data providers who are providing the data, it's also the people who expect to use the data, right? Community members, teachers, others. So it's that governance decision-making process that shaped our work plan, and that's why we're making the dashboards first. So I think like who's making the decisions and who's at the table, not just like who can show up and give public comment, but like who's at the table with a vote really changes how the work is done. And I can say that I do my work differently now, reporting to a 21-person governing board with public members than I would if I were still working at a university-based setting in a different way. So decision-making governance really matters for that. Final thing on funding, I think the state funding is incredibly important because it's huge and it matters. Philanthropy also can play an important role. There's a whole coalition of equity-focused, community-based organizations who received funding from philanthropy over the last years to follow the work of the creation of this data system. So they have staff positions who can show up here in Sacramento, who can come to the meetings, who can write their briefs and say, this is what the data system should do. Don't forget about your promise. You said you would do this. Do it, right? It takes a lot of resources to be able to watch what we're doing and hold us accountable. So I think that philanthropy has also played a really important role in that.
I think also one of the nice things about working across sort of sectors, working government and universities and community organizations, is that we do have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we approach philanthropy. And I think increasingly some big foundations are interested in that kind of partnership, and it gives us flexibility. At the university we have grant writers and we have sort of people who will prospect and think about the options for raising money. And so, we're not a consulting firm. We don't need to make money. We just need to cover our costs. And so to really be able to leverage not just the sort of researchers, but the apparatus of the university to do that kind of fundraising, I think has been really valuable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Miles from United Food and Commercial Workers Western States Council. We're a labor union representing over 180,000 workers in California. You know us best for grocery stores, but we also have farm workers, food processing workers, pharmacy workers, run the gamut. So in our workforce development expansion, we have major issues with the array of industries and occupations we represent. So Bureau of Labor Statistics is my enemy, with the really tight definitions of ONET, so SOC codes, and of course NAICS codes. And I'm wondering how the state, and in conjunction with the Possibility Lab, is thinking about the issues more broadly. I was on a meeting with Sebastian earlier, where I stated, a lot of our farm workers in off-season will work in food processing plants. They're not treated as a whole person because they're treated as, separate industries, separate occupations, but it's the same person. So that's one thing that I'm really curious about how the state is looking at that, Marianne, but also secondly, and more importantly for my purposes, I'm wondering how we can engage with the Possibility Lab to partner. Is there a strategy? Is there a point person? How do we go about that?
So I'm happy to answer the first question. We actually developed a 5-year timeline for where we want to focus across the different years of building the data system and where we want to expand the data that's coming in. And this fiscal year, we're actually focused on a public process and getting input on bringing more workforce and earnings data into the data system, in part to address exactly the challenge that you mentioned. If someone's showing up in different kinds of data systems in different ways and it's not being linked together, it's really hard to get that full picture. So part of the work we're doing collaboratively with Labor and Workforce Development Agency is to get input on what data points, ideally that are already collected by an entity at the state level, could we bring together in the data system to make it much easier for the public and for our partners to understand the comprehensive picture of how people are engaging in the labor market. It's one of the major priorities. So that, with the cradle to career data system, we've got a lot of K-12 and higher education data right now, and the bookends around early childhood education is another major challenge that we're going to be working towards with our partners, and more workforce and earnings data is something. So stay tuned. I think we'll probably have public meetings about this the first half of next year, and would be happy to have your input.
Sarah, I'm thinking right now of the challenge we have internally about defining what a farm worker is. We have, under the wage orders, there's 2 different definitions of what a farm worker is. Under the labor code, for the ALRB, there's a different scope of what a farm worker is. EDD uses migrant seasonal farm workers with very specific areas of work. So that's one of the first challenges we're trying to engage is, how do you define who a farm worker is? So it's certainly a challenge. I don't have any answers for you, but it's something that we're looking at and really trying to understand. Can we simplify this? It's hard because there's all these different definitions that have been created over time, whether it's federal definitions or state definitions for different purposes, and I think it's going to take a lot of work and legislation to modify, but yeah, I share your frustration.
I'll just say, and I know I think it's responsive to the energy that you bring to this, which I think is awesome. When I was working at the federal government, we had issues around what data was collected and what definitions were used for who's targeted for a hate crime. Very quickly, there was a horrific incident at Sikh Gurdwara, where white nationalists went and murdered Sikhs that were worshiping. Sikhs were not captured. You could not be targeted for a hate crime as an anti-Sikh. It was other. So we saw the FBI's data changed, but it was because of advocates, because of people telling stories, because of people saying, like, this is, and I will just say in a quirk for the way hate crimes are measured is the intent of the perpetrator, and if a perpetrator is ignorant and directing bias, in this case, they said they were targeting people because they thought they were Muslim. It counts as an anti-Muslim hate crime. But when people went before Congress and you heard the children and the spouses and the grandchildren of people who were murdered in that setting and saying, we don't count, like, we don't count, you don't have a way of counting us, they actually changed the law. So that's not directly responsive. They're more directly responsive, but what I would say is, like, yeah, bring it up, show it, because that's how we change laws and how we change the way we actually capture data.
Thank you. And yes, please. We're at Possibility Lab at berkeley.edu, and we're always excited to hear what everyone's up to. So please reach out. I think we have time for one more question.
Awesome. Heather Ryden, UC Davis, Western Center for Ag Health and Safety. Hey, Sarah. Actually, it launches well off of the question about definitions. I was curious in the way, and maybe, Amy, this is a little bit more for you, and how you work with different agencies or partners. How do you work on the defining the question, the variables, and making sure that whomever is entering the data, whether they're a state representative, local government, or maybe one of our CBO partners, are entering the same thing consistently across individuals? Because I think those of us who interact at all with data know that the quality of the results is so dependent on what goes in.
This is a really important question. I think this gets to the sort of thinking about partnership early, helping to design the data input process and really think about who's doing the data entry and how they're thinking about it and what kind of standards you have to establish around things like measurement. And that can be anything from, right, if residents are entering their own information within an interface, like, how do you make sure that you're clarifying in the instructions how they should be thinking about checking this box instead of this box? Or it can be sort of thinking about how workers within different agencies that are going to share data enter those data. Or it can be about things like when one of the questions that we've run into is if you have one individual, but you have two different records and they're listing different racial groups, right? What do you do with those data and how do you reconcile it into some kind of data set? Do you represent both of those with dates in a longitudinal way, or do you sort of combine them in some way and give priority to the first or the most recent. These are all questions that make a huge difference when it comes to what you're going to be able to draw from the data. So I think thinking about those kinds of questions, and not just coming in at the end and saying, you have data, we'll look at it, but really thinking from the very first moment, what question are we trying to answer? Why are we trying to answer it? What kind of data do we need in order to answer this question well? What does it mean to collect those data? And then how are we going to analyze it sort of at the very end? And I think also thinking about how we work together to make sure that we're all really understanding all of those questions, I think has been a huge piece of the work that we do.
One small thing I'll add to that is I think the process of bringing together data for a purpose can also help shape those data collection efforts. So for example, when we're creating our dashboards, we want to let people disaggregate by geography and by race and ethnicity and gender. Those are the most requested feature requests we get. On race and ethnicity, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that our partners, almost all of them, have a slightly different list. So for example, one of the key asks of a committee on transfers and many entities within the state is our ability to disaggregate race and ethnicity categories much more, not just have, for example, one category for Asian. Well, we can do that only to the extent that our partners are collecting the same list, right? Otherwise, you have collapse this down to the groups that everyone's collecting. The fact that we're doing this together collaboratively opens up the possibility for conversations about that. And again, going back to governance, I'm just going to keep beating that drum. Who's making the decisions about this and what table are they at? That can help change the conversation around how we're collecting that data as a state and what standards or what norms do we want to do. So the path is long and change. And I love the example you gave where people's specific stories changed what data points were collected. That can happen across so many different dimensions.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you so much to our incredible partners for being here today. And there is food. Thank you all.